All right, this video is just to connect us up to the current situation. We have data up to August 2020. And for each of these, I'll start back with the financial crisis, just so we can kind of see how the trend is different, how this one looks very different than the previous recession. So as of the previous recession, for women, the labor force participation in early 2000 had hit around 60, which was kind of a peak and had kind of stalled out since then. But after the financial crisis, there was some decline. Okay, so this would have been straight across. So there was a decline of about 2-3%. Okay, so there was a little bit of decline. Some of this was probably people becoming discouraged after they couldn't find another job and deciding not to look for one again. And some of this was also have to do with the aging of the population because the baby boomers are reaching their retirement age during this period of time, and then they are out of the labor force. For men, it's basically the same trend, except for the men were following this downward, long-term downward trend. But this trend kind of accelerated during this time. Some of this has stabilized since about 2013, 2014, once the economy got much better. Before that time, the labor market was not doing very well. It was still in recovery mode. So anyways, now going to the current situation is for both groups, we just see a huge downward movement in labor force participation. Which is very sudden. So you can see this recession looks totally different than any of the previous ones in the data because it's just so sudden and it has such a big kind of measurable effect. So we see each one of them is going downwards by, it looks like about 3-4%, and it looks about the same for men and women. It's possible the recovery in labor force participation is slightly better for men, but both of them look about the same downwards, and they're kind of recovering. The question is, we don't know how they're going to recover, so we don't know if it's going to be like this or probably more likely like this. Okay, so we don't know. But the main thing we can see is just really sudden and really dramatic in the effect here. And in both men and women, the labor force participation went down, and it is coming back up pretty rapidly too, but we really don't know what's going to happen going into the future. Looking at race, it's pretty much the same thing, but race is a little different. I don't have the numbers for the Asian American group here. Partly I just couldn't get them from the source I was looking at, and I was kind of pressed for time. But I believe they're fairly stable, but they're somewhere in between the white numbers and the Hispanic numbers. Remember, before this time, the labor force participation for the Hispanic Latino group was very stable and high. But after the financial crisis, there was some decrease. Okay, so this is trending down, but then it stabilized. So by about 2011, this stabilized again, and it's still high compared to the other two groups. But we see a huge effect from the COVID shutdowns. Okay, a huge effect and a partial recovery. Right, so we see this really huge effect, and we see a partial recovery. For the white group, this downward trend has just continued. Now, part of that has to do with age, and it kind of slowed down a little bit now, but in the long run, it has just continued. Some of this has to do with age, and this is men and women put together. This group is quite a bit older than the other two groups in terms of median age, and so there are going to be more people hitting retirement age. So that's part of this, but part of this might also be people who are just choosing to leave the labor force. We'll look at it later next week, but the opioid epidemic has been more prevalent in the white community, especially for white men. And this also has had some effect on labor force participation as well. Right now it's very speculative. We'll come back and look a little bit more at this next time. The good news for this group is the hit from COVID was smaller. And this very likely has to do with the industries that this group is concentrated in, probably more industries where somebody can work from home or industries that were not laid off during this time. The group for African Americans, there was also the same. So basically, the financial crisis had this effect on all groups. The good news for African Americans is after this initial downward, there was some starting to, as the labor market got really tight and unemployment got low, there was some re-entry back into the labor force. So we actually saw an increasing of labor force participation, which is something kind of similar was happening for Hispanics, so not quite as clear of a trend. But the bad news is the decrease from the COVID shutdowns was also big. Okay, and so again, a lot of this probably has to do with what industries people are in, and if people are in the industries that can't be done from distance and were shut down, then they're obviously more likely to lose their job, and if they might just leave the labor force altogether, at least temporarily. So we don't really know what's going to happen to these in the future, whether they're going to bounce back up or whether they're going to be a slow recovery. Okay, so that's something we will find out in the future. We're hoping for the best, but we don't know for sure. All right, moving on. Now we're looking at unemployment rate. So as we said in the unit, the typical pattern over recent years since 1980 was during recessions, this happened. So during recessions, men had a higher unemployment rate than women. And this is mostly to do with what industries they were in. So men are more concentrated in industries like construction, and before were also more concentrated in finance as well as manufacturing. And all of these things tend to slow down a lot during recessions. Durable goods sales tend to slow down, which affects manufacturing, and home sales tend to slow down, which affects construction. And the last recession happened in the financial markets. Okay, so that's been the typical pattern since 1980, but this pattern was reversed for the current recession. Okay, so for the current recession, actually, women's unemployment rate went much higher than men's, or not quite a bit higher than men's, partly because of the nature of the industries that were shut down. Okay, so we'll come back to this. I'll share in a couple of weeks when we talk about the occupational distribution. I'll share an article that discusses this situation. Right, so women were hit a little bit harder in terms of unemployment rate, but also they've also in another way been hit pretty hard in the sense of with kids out of school and many daycares closed down and such like that. Women have, in many cases, if in their family they were taking a bigger responsibility with the children, then even if they are still working during the work from home, they might be facing a bigger burden. Okay, again, this is not in every case, but in families that are following gender roles where the mother tends to take the biggest role, then women will be hit a little bit harder, or quite a bit harder. And also there's a lot of single parent families, and there's a lot more that are single mothers, and they would also be hit very hard by these other things happening, which we can't see in this graph. Okay. The last case is looking for race. Okay, so looking for race. So this includes Hispanic, white, black, and Asian. And we know this pattern before. We saw this in an earlier video, that the unemployment rates for African Americans are higher than all of the other groups, and generally this continues through good times and in bad, although generally the rates get closer together during good times, and that the unemployment rates for Hispanics is sort of in the middle, and then whites and Asians tend to be pretty similar in the rates. So the one thing that did happen during this current recession is, and this is the first time I believe in the data that I've ever seen, is that the unemployment rate briefly for Hispanics went higher than for African Americans. And I believe it was mainly, again, due to the concentration in specific industries that were shut down. So being very concentrated in services, for example, like the restaurant industry and the hotel industry that were shut down, had a big effect on the Hispanic community. So in the bottom of this week's learning unit, I shared a couple video and a couple of articles that go into discussing why particularly these two groups, Hispanics and African Americans, were so heavily hit by the COVID pandemic. And it's sort of this double, kind of a double, well, maybe you could even say a triple whammy, but if we just focus on the economic aspects, you have that because of the industries people are concentrated in, they're less likely to be able to work from home, and so therefore more likely to have an industry that was shut down, so people are more likely to lose their jobs. But at the same time, the people who are still working are more likely to be in face-to-face jobs, or jobs that involve face-to-face services, or jobs that involve lots of contact with other people, for example, like working in a food processing plant or something like that. And so more potential exposure to COVID at work. So we get this, of the people lots of people losing their jobs in these two groups, and of the people who are still working, lots of people are exposed to being more likely to get COVID from their workplace. And then when you add the third aspect, we also have big health and wealth disparities that make it more difficult more vulnerable to COVID, and also more difficult financially to absorb this kind of shock. So we have kind of 4 big factors going on there. So anyways, we're not getting into this super far right now, and we might not throughout the semester, partly because some of this is so new that it's a little bit speculative. Without having research to depend on, I have to kind of speculate. But anyways, I still wanted to expose you to this information. Let me know if you have any questions in the final forum for this week.